Okay, so that I can post them. Okay. Good, that disappears. Today we're going to be talking about something that we're going to be talking about all semester long, and that's what this first term is, homeostasis. I introduced you to that a little bit the other day when I was talking in our first day handout. I think that was the very first course competency, be able to define and explain homeostasis. This is the backbone of this class. Okay. Pictured on the first page here, I always try to do this, something that pertains to the lecture, a little, in this case, a cartoon. This cartoon is a picture of what we call the Vitruvian Man. I won't really get into him too much. He was drawn for the first time and actually created by a famous fellow named Leonardo da Vinci. But he used him to kind of explain relationships that exist between the human body and the physical world, that kind of stuff. So it's actually kind of become a mascot or something of that nature, you could say, to health, human body, anatomy, physiology. So you'll see him from time to time. Now that you kind of know who he is. The reason I chose this picture is because this Vitruvian Man is standing on something. You can call it a teeter-totter, you can call it a balance, something of that nature, okay? Because that's what we're going to talk a lot about in this class, and that's really what homeostasis is, the term balance. Okay, I'm not going to define it quite yet. There's a more complicated term for that, or description for homeostasis, but that's what we're talking about in this class, keeping our body in balance best we can. Because if, for example, he's standing on this teeter-totter, he's nice in balance right now, but if he shifts his weight a little bit, what happens? He gets out of balance, right? Okay, and that's what's happening to us all the time, every day, every second, every minute. Okay, we're always being disrupted from our perfect balance. Okay. Before we define homeostasis, let's just define what we're going to be studying in this class, and that is physiology. Okay, now, if you guys are looking in your notes, you'll see there are blanks. These blanks typically I bold in the term that goes in that blank for you guys to fill in. Okay. Kind of a buzzword a lot of times that I choose. If I ever talk while you guys are writing and you didn't hear me, which I try not to do, but it does happen, just tell me to repeat it. If I repeat something several times, my advice would be to write it down. Okay, that kind of stuff. Physiology is defined as the study of normal biological function, from cell to tissue, tissue to organ, organ to system, as well as how the organism functions to carry out normal bodily functions. So that's a long sentence. You can simplify it and just say it's a description of how the body works. Okay. Now, in this class, we place an emphasis on mechanisms, how a particular action is performed. For example, how the heart beats, how heart rate is regulated. And those are examples that we'll see and study this semester at various points. When we see these things, a lot of what we see for answers is a direct result of a cause and effect situation. This causes this, which causes this, which causes this. Sometimes it's a cause that causes the cause, It's a 10-step process. This does this does that. As a result, finally, you get to the point where you have the end effect. Okay. Human physiology considers topics such as molecular mechanisms responsible for muscle contraction, communication between cells using chemical messengers, parts of brain involved in language and comprehension and expression, the maintenance of blood pressure by coordinated efforts of your heart, kidneys, brain, and glands. Those are all just broad examples. Could have put a million different things there. But because physiology has a broad scope, it's divided into many subdisciplines, which is what table 1.1 is showing you on the right. Okay. Not a table that I would ask you to know or anything like that, just included it. We will talk about many of those. For example, the second one, or the first two we'll be getting into in this unit. Okay, we'll talk about cardiovascular physiology later on the semester, respiratory physiology, so on and so forth. Okay. The physiological processes and regulatory mechanisms that we study in this class exist for a common purpose, which is to, there's that word, maintain homeostasis. What did we say? Simple way to describe homeostasis is balance. As you study physiology, your exploration of the human body will extend from atoms to molecules to the whole person. From smallest to largest, there are 6 levels of organization that will help you to understand how the body functions. We call these the levels of organization, and it is a way to describe how we're put together in a very coordinated, very amazing way, starting at the simplest, which is the chemical level, all the way to the most complex, which is us at the most complex organismal level. Some organisms, like a bacteria, for example, simple single-celled organism, don't have 6 levels. But all living things are well organized. Even a dandelion or a blade of grass is made up of several levels of organization. Okay. We just happen to be one of the most complex. Okay. Even at the simplest level, we're complex. Okay. And this is what we'll be talking about starting on Friday when we talk about atoms and molecules, which everybody just loves. Okay. That's the chemical level. An atom, I'm sure you learned about way back in high school biology, if you've taken other classes as well. Smallest unit of matter that participates in chemical reactions. This is where you find, when we talk about electrons and protons and neutrons. I'm sure you've all been exposed to the periodic table of elements before, where you can look at little boxes like inside that have carbon or hydrogen, oxygen, gold, silver, those types of things, each of which has unique properties. Each of those boxes in the periodic table represents what one atom of that element would be. You can't just crack us open and find those elements individually. You can't find just a singular atom unless you look really in depth. What you find are those atoms put together in molecules. We're still talking super tiny here. Molecules of things like water and glucose and proteins. Okay, molecules are 2 or more atoms joined together. Okay, what is another way to describe water? H2O. 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen. Okay, I was just saying the periodic table, big table with lots and lots of elements. Not all of those pertain to us. Internally, we're made up of predominantly 4. If you can remember CHON, that's 96% of us, roughly. CHON is short for carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. We've also got others like phosphorus, that's like in our DNA. Calcium, everybody knows our calcium's a strong component of our what? Bones and teeth. Even sulfur in small amounts. We'll talk more about those next time. We take molecules, we can combine them together and form organelles, like the powerhouse of the cell. Everybody's heard that term before, I'm sure. That's what mitochondria are, and ribosomes, and the nucleus of a cell, all of which have a specific function and collectively form our cells. So now we're moving up to the cellular level. A cell is described as a basic structural and functional unit of an organism. In some cases, that's the organism, like the bacteria in our gut. 1 cell, that's it. That's their highest level of organization. And we can describe cells as the smallest units capable of performing all life processes. We'll talk about those life processes here in a minute. And they are composed of many different organelles, as I was just mentioning. In our body, we take those cells and we put them together into tissues. A group of similar cells develop together, forming the same growth structure. There are 4 principal types of tissues. Epithelial, which covers like our skin, is the inside of our mouth, inside of our stomach, forms our sweat glands, that kind of stuff. Connective, does what it sounds like, it connects. The bones are made of connective, ligaments and tendons. that kind of stuff. Your blood's actually a form of connective. Muscle moves either us as a whole with our skeletal muscle, or it moves stuff internally, like our heart, which is a muscle that pumps blood. The muscle in the walls of your stomach that help move stuff around and digest it. And then the nervous tissue, which is the most complex, allows for the most complex functions, performing and creating action potentials. We take tissues and we can form organs like our brain and our stomach that I've mentioned. An organ is a structure composed of two or more different types of tissues, typically has a specific function and always, but not always, usually, but not always recognizable shape. Organs are then grouped together to make what we call systems. Okay, system is also known as organ system, a group of related organs, common function, like the digestive system, respiratory system. I think those were two that were shown in that table on the previous page. The main way that we go through this class is by system, meaning we go from one system, talk about that, then we go to the next system. Now, depending on which textbook you look at, your white textbook classifies the body as having 11 systems. Other textbook might see it as 12 systems. It's kind of just how they categorize things. But those 11 or 12 systems collectively form us, the organism, any living individual made up of those many organ systems, which are listed here on this next page. And multicellular organisms have a series of organs and organ systems functioning in homeostasis. We're a multicellular organism, so we have these organs and organ systems. Changes in our external environment can trigger changes in the internal environment as a response. Now, what do I mean when I say external environment? What do I mean when I say internal environment? We all know external and internal are opposite one another, right? So what's our external environment? What's our internal environment? Say that louder, I'm sorry. Atmosphere, so outside of us, right? Okay, the external environment's everything around us and outside of us. Okay, the oxygen levels in the atmosphere. You climb a mountain, oxygen levels, I'll say it that way, but it's not actually the way it is. Pressure of oxygen changes, which means the amount of oxygen in our body changes, right? The internal environment is inside of us. An even easier illustration of that or explanation of that would be the temperature outside. It's been really hot lately, right? What happens when you go outside and it's really hot? We sweat, that's a response. Why do we sweat? What happens to our body? It gets hot. External environment results in a change in our internal environment. The organ systems that we have work together to help maintain homeostasis in our internal environment. Here are those, and this is listed out as 12 systems, the components and functions of them. We will go through most of them, not all of them, in great detail. For example, we don't really cover much about the integumentary system or the skeletal system. We will talk about them at points, but we will talk a lot about things like the nervous system that's listed there at the top. We'll spend 4 whole lectures just dedicated to that system alone. And we'll talk about them all, for the most part, in great detail. This next term, integration, describes the process by which several components work together for a common unified purpose. I told you guys the other day that I'm a football fan. I like K-State, like the Chiefs. Okay, if you're not familiar with football, there are 11 players on each team on the field at a time. How many systems did I say there were? 11 or 12, right? Okay. Each player on a football team that's on the field has a job. A quarterback is the one that throws the ball or hands it off. Running back runs it. Wide receivers catch it. Linemen block. They all have a job to do. All those systems have a job to do. Like a football team, if one system's not working, what happens? A player doesn't do what they're supposed to do, what happens? Just like in basketball, when you only have 5 players, right? Somebody's not doing their job, play doesn't work, right? And the body shuts down when one system stops working correctly. And they all have to work together. That's what integration is. And that's why I really like this kind of complex, wacky-looking figure, which is an illustration of the human body and those systems. Internally, this picture has the systems kind of boxed off with arrows and lines connecting to one another. Okay. Demonstrating how they all work together. So the body is much more than the sum of its parts. It's the result of integrated activities between components, essentially all levels of organization. I always point out the nervous system. Look at all the lines connected to it. We'll talk a lot about how the nervous system is really, along with the endocrine system, in charge. It's got its hands on everything. It's like the quarterback of the body. Okay, if I go back a couple slides, I'm gonna just read one sentence, and then I'll go back to that slide. This under cells, it says cells are the smallest units capable of performing all life processes. That's what these things are. The basic life processes that distinguish organisms or living things from non-living things. We all as a whole can do these 6 things. So can every single one of our cells. And so can a bacteria. Can a rock. Can your table. Can the water in your Gatorade. No. Okay. Those are not living things. They cannot perform metabolism. Our first one. Okay. Metabolism is something we'll talk a lot more about in our next lecture. The sum of all chemical processes or reactions occurring in the body, which can be classified into 2 phases, catabolism and anabolism. Okay. Catabolism is where you break down more complex things into smaller, simpler things, like the digestive system breaking down complex food into simpler food molecules, like the protein that's in a cheeseburger broken down into simpler amino acids. And that way we can take those amino acids into our body and we can make proteins in places like our muscle. And that means we're going to perform anabolism, synthesizing complex cellular structures from simpler ones. So they're the opposite of one another. Breaking from big to little is catabolism. Building up from little to big is anabolism. So building muscle mass, example, scar formation, both are anabolic. Responsiveness is our body's ability to detect and respond to changes. Okay, I asked you just a little bit ago what happens when you go outside when it's hot. Somebody said you sweat, right? Okay, you are responding to a change, okay, which can be internal or external. Okay. An example that I have listed here is decrease in body temperature, signals sensors in the skin, respond by shivering. So it's the opposite of what we said. That would be what we do when we get cold, right? And I also teach this class in the spring, and at that point, this is like January, so that analogy works better then than right now, because it's not cold, it's hot. Movement. Movement can be of the whole organism, like I'm doing right now as I walk around. Individual organs, single cells, or even organelles within a cell. Growth is an increase in size of a body part or the entire organism, which can come in one of two ways. Either increasing the number of cells, so cells divide, like that's how our bones grow, 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 cells, so on and so forth. Or the cells can just get bigger, which is how like our muscles grow. Okay. Reproduction refers to either the formation of new cells, which happens much more rapidly, cellular reproduction, mitosis, or excuse me, that allows for tissue growth, repair, or replacement, or what happens much less frequently would be production of an entire new offspring, new individual making a baby. Is what I'm talking about here. We call that organismic reproduction. Differentiation is the change a cell undergoes to develop from an unspecialized cell to a specialized cell, which is, how do I say this? Going from like a blank slate, like a blank canvas if you're an artist, and making it fancy. Okay. We have certain cells in our body called stem cells that can become other types of cells, more complex, more fancy cells. Now, you hear about stem cell research, that kind of stuff. Okay, stem cell research, that's what they're talking about, like embryonic stem cells. Those are like the ultimate blank slate. They can become any type of cell, which is why they are used to, grow things. We as adults have stem cells, but sometimes those are a little less broad in what they can form. I mean, it might only be able to make a blood cell, might be able to make a bone cell. Could be any of the cells in the body. Okay. Now, when any of these life processes cease to occur properly, a result would be death of cells and tissues, which may lead to the death of the organism. Obviously not what we want to have happen. All right, finally we get to define that term homeostasis. Okay, reading through. The cells that comprise the human body are able to thrive because they live in relative constancy of our body's internal environment, despite continual changes in our body's external environment. In other words, we are able to have relative balance even though we are constantly being disrupted. Just going from this room, which is set at 69 degrees Fahrenheit, to outside, it can be a fluctuation of 20 degrees. But our body temperature doesn't change much because we are constantly responding. Okay, there's one of those things I was just talking about. Okay. Homeostasis is defined as a condition of equilibrium, or in parentheses, there's that word balance, in the body's internal environment due to constant interaction of our body's many regulatory processes. So all those things we've been talking about already, and the interaction of those organ systems and cells provide us with our balance. Now, homeostasis can be described as dynamic. What do I mean when I say dynamic? Anybody know? I'll give you a hint. It means the opposite of static. And if you think static, think stationary. If something's stationary, it's not what? Moving. So what does dynamic mean then? It's constantly moving. Okay. The things that we have to regulate, blood pressure and heart rate, body temperature, your blood sugar, those things are always moving. Never are they just staying put all day, every day. Now, can all of those different things change dramatically? Some, yes. Okay. Like your heart rate, which might be somewhere around 50, 70 beats a minute right now. But if I ask you guys to run around the building, it might go up to 150. That's a change of 100 beats a minute. Can your temperature change 100 degrees? God, no. We're screwed after like a change of 5-7 degrees. Okay, so we have what we call narrow limits, which are these ranges within we can be compatible with. In other words, if we lose that range or we get outside that range, we start to shut down and bad things happen. Okay. The example down here at the bottom illustrates blood sugar, blood glucose, same thing, and how that can fluctuate around what we call a set point. The dotted line in there is the set point, which is the average value of that given condition. Never is it just straight at 90 milligrams per milliliter, but it's averaged around there as it goes up and down throughout the day. And just like your heart rate or your body temperature, your blood pressure, those kinds of things are all fluctuating around a set point. So a set point can also be described as the narrow range within which a control variable should be maintained. I've already kind of told you the first sentence here, homeostasis is a dynamic or ever-changing situation as it's constantly being disrupted. But you have to remember that disruptions can come both externally and internally, meaning outside the body or inside the body. Okay. Outside the body examples we have here, intense heat or cold. We've talked about that one already. Lack of oxygen at high altitudes, starvation, and the disruptions from the external environment are typically physical in nature. And some can be very extreme, like, 130 degrees as it was in Death Valley last week, climbing to the top of Mount Everest. Some are much more subtle. They'll result in a big change to the body. Disruptions of homeostasis may also be internal. Some may be temporary and the body can respond quickly and efficiently to restore balance in the internal environment. However, some can be severe enough to cause disease or even death. Great example of that would be right now with what we're suffering around the world. Coronavirus, right? It gets into your body and it can change the way your organs are working. Okay, unfortunately, it can result in disease and unfortunately death as well. Now, to prevent disease and death, we help maintain homeostasis, or once again, balance. And there are two major systems that are most responsible for doing so: our nervous and endocrine systems. The nervous system and endocrine system work together. They also work independently of one another. They work in different manners. The nervous system is a very rapid responding system. Okay. It is going to regulate homeostasis by employing electrical signals known as nerve impulses, or what I use more frequently the term action potentials. Okay. When you touch a hot stove, how long is it before you respond by moving your hand off the stove? Immediate. Not even a second goes by and your hand's off the stove. Okay, even before you really feel that pain, your hand is off the stove. So it's lightning quick, milliseconds. This system responds to changes that are detected by sensors. In this case, hand on a hot stove triggers a response, or triggers the sensors in our skin sensitive to temperature and pain. Okay. Those then send a signal up into our brain and spinal cord, where we then trigger a response. In this case, moving the hand off the stove. And the effectors in that case would be our skeletal muscles that pull the hand away. And we also utilize specialty sensory organs You guys are doing so right now with your eyes. Okay. That provide input to your brain for what you're seeing. Your ears are doing the same, but for what you're hearing. Okay. We process most of that sensory information in our brain. Sometimes we process stuff in our spinal cord, and we elicit responses accordingly. The endocrine system is a second type of homeostatic control system, involves chemical components. Those chemicals are called hormones that are released in response to a change, and those hormones are dumped into the blood, where they're then carried, in many cases, to a whole lot of organs to bring about the change in the target organ. As I mentioned, a lot of times these two systems work together. Some reflexes employ both nervous and endocrine responses. The nervous system, as I mentioned, is very rapid. The endocrine system is much more slow. Okay, think of it, compare them like a text message. Once you hit send, it's going to be right there on their phone. Whereas if you send a letter in the mail, it takes days to get there. Yeah. Regardless, both means of regulation work towards that same goal, restoring homeostasis. One of the most important things that we must maintain as far as homeostasis goes in our body is the volume and composition of our body fluids. How many people have heard that your body is like 75% water? Well, if you haven't, now you have. Yeah. We're very watery inside. We have a lot of body fluids, and there are a lot of different types of body fluids. We have different amounts to each of those. We have different things within those. Even though we are like 75% water, it's not just water inside of us. Okay. So what do I mean when I say the volume and composition of body fluids? What's a volume? The measurement of the amount. Okay. What do I mean when I say composition? Not how much, but what's in it. So the water plus other things like the electrolytes that we get from things like Gatorade in our diet. And because body fluids are not just watery, they also contain dissolved chemicals. Now we have two major types of body fluids, those that are inside our cells and those that are outside the cells. The prefix intra, always know that means inside. Intracellular fluid, therefore, is fluid that's inside our cells. Extra means outside. This is fluid outside the cells. Okay. There's also what we call interstitial fluid. Inter means between. This is fluid between our cells. So intra, within, extra, outside, inter, between. You have to write that down. It might not be a bad idea. Some of the most important extracellular fluids include blood plasma. I like to kind of talk about this as like the ultimate fluid, because this is the first location where water goes when we bring it into our body from our intestines and stomach. After I take a gulp of my water, it goes into my stomach and then it crosses into my blood. From there, that water can travel and become intracellular fluid, meaning that it can move into cells. Lymph is extracellular fluid within lymphatic vessels. Cerebrospinal fluid is a very small amount of fluid, but very, very important, because that it interacts with our brain function, spinal cord function. Synovial fluid, we don't really talk about that too much in this class. It is in our joints and helps with lubrication, keeps our joints able to move. What we really don't talk about in this class are the two fluids in our eyes, aqueous humor and vitreous body. Those obviously help with vision. Because it's present around all cells in the body, interstitial fluid is sometimes referred to as our internal environment. Now it's important to think of the fluids in our body like a river and not like a pond. So what do I mean when I say that? What's the difference between a river and a pond? A river flows. It circulates. Fluids in our body, along with nutrients, are also flowing. Even wastes are flowing as well. And we have to bring those things in or push them out in order to maintain homeostasis. Okay. What's cool is, like I said, when water enters the body from our cup, it goes to our stomach and intestines, and then we absorb it into our blood. It doesn't just stay in the blood. That water can then leave the blood and enter the interstitial space, becoming interstitial fluid. It can then go into our cells and become intracellular fluid. It then can go back and become blood plasma. And maybe eventually it goes down to our kidneys and we get it out of the body altogether in the form of urine. Okay, so water is always circulating. So are these nutrients like oxygen and the nutrients that we eat and drink. And we bring them and we circulate them, and we circulate waste to get them out of the body, like the CO2 that we breathe off. Or in the case of the water that I was just saying, that we pee off in urine. We are always moving stuff around. All right, let's talk about feedback loops. Feedback system, I have it titled that way. Typically, I call them loops. You'll see why. But these are a cycle of events in which the status of a body condition is monitored, evaluated, changed, remonitored, reevaluated forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And each monitored variable is termed a control condition. Everything that we are monitoring in our body, in other words, is a control condition. I've given you several examples. Heart rate and blood pressure, body temperature, blood sugar. What else do we regulate in our body? What are we monitoring? Oxygen levels. Calcium levels. I mean, we could go on for a long time, right? Okay. So every single one of those things that we're monitoring is called a controlled condition. And anything that disrupts that condition is called a, excuse me, a stimulus. Okay. And if we see a change occurring to our body as a result of a stimulus, we're going to employ a feedback loop, which involves three basic components. Here's what it looks like. I'll bounce back and forth. Okay, so a stimulus here at the top of our figure disrupts homeostasis by increasing or decreasing a control condition. We could pretend it's heart rate, we could pretend it's blood pressure, body temperature, doesn't matter at this point. We first have in our feedback loop receptors. Receptors, also known as sensors, are the things that detect that change. These are often neurons or gland cells, and they respond to that change by initiating what we call input. Input is the signal that then travels either as a nerve impulse or chemical signal to our second component, the control center or integrating center. Now, what we know this from when we're kids, what's in charge of our body for the most part? What organ? The brain. The brain is typically the location of our control center, a specific region of our brain. It's not just the whole brain. There are parts to our brain. This is where we set the narrow limits for which that control condition can be maintained. For example, this is where we control how hot or how cold we can get without things going bad. Okay. So we get hot. That stimulates the sensors in our skin, which then provide the input to our brain. It says, hey, I'm hot. The brain processes that information. It says, okay, what do I need to do? Okay. The brain, in this case, is our control center, results with a output signal. The output signal goes out, so it's a signal that goes out. And what do we do when we get hot? We sweat. What do we do when we get cold? We shiver. Okay. Where does sweat come from? Yes, but what organ? Sweat glands, right? What's shivering when we are shaking? What's causing us to shake? Your skeletal muscles. Okay. Your glands of the body, your muscles of the body are the effectors, which are going to produce a response. And touching that hot stove causes us to move our hand off the stove. How do we get our hand off the stove? We contract what? Muscles in our arm. Okay. Now, nearly every organ or tissue can be an effector, but typically there's 3 types of muscle. Skeletal, that's in our muscles around our bones. Cardiac muscle, that's in our heart. Smooth muscle, that's found in places like our intestines and stomach, our blood vessels, and then glands, like our sweat glands I was mentioning. And they are what produce the response. Okay? And they result with a change that then alters our controlled condition, hopefully bringing us back to what? Homeostasis, or balance. So a group of receptors and effectors communicating with their control center forms a feedback system that can regulate a control variable in our body's internal environment. In a feedback system, the response of the system feeds back information to change the controlled variable in some way. So that's why I like feedback loop. You can see a loop is a circle. Okay. Now, there's 2 types of feedback, negative and positive. Now, when you hear the term negative, it might just make you think that's bad, but that's not the case. Negative is good, so it's positive. Negative just refers to something that I'm going to talk about right now, and that's the fact that it's an inhibitory response, okay? Meaning it opposes a change. The terms inhibitory, oppose, those are very good things to know. Another great thing would be opposite. Underline those, highlight those if you need to. Those should help you understand what I mean. Okay. So we've used body temperature a lot so far. This example is blood pressure. In this case, the stimulus causes our blood pressure to go up. So what do? We respond by bringing it where? Back down. So it goes up. We go back down. Those up and down are opposite, right? Okay, we're inhibiting whatever's going on to the body to bring us back into homeostasis. So they oppose a change by creating a response opposite in direction of the initial disturbance. Keeps variables from straying too far outside their normal ranges. Common examples include blood pressure and temperature changes. Write this down. This is the most common type of response. Most of the time when we respond, it's by negative feedback. Negative feedback is much more common than positive feedback. We're only going to see a few examples of positive feedback in this class. Positive feedback systems are going to be described as stimulatory. They amplify or accelerate a change. I like that sentence. So it'd be like if our body temperature goes up, and what do? We start to shiver. And what would that make us do? Get hotter, right? And hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. But typically, we don't want to keep going in that direction, but there are times where we do. Okay, so a positive feedback system operates similarly to a negative feedback system, except for the way the response affects the control variable. Control center still provides commands to an effector, in this case, brain, sending output to the walls of the uterus during childbirth. Okay. When a female is getting ready to give birth to a baby, she starts having contractions. and the contractions start speeding up. And what happens to the strength of the contractions? They get stronger. Okay. That's because her cervix is stretching more and more and more as the baby's pushing down through the uterus and out into the vagina. Okay. The more stretching of the cervix, the more of an input signal is sent to the brain, which means more release of a hormone called oxytocin. More oxytocin, more contractions, stronger contractions. And then the baby's born, and what happens to the contractions? They stop, but it takes a little while because the cervix will be stretched out for a little while until it goes back. It's not an immediate response because at that point, the cervix is no longer stretched. There's no input because there's no change to the wall. Okay. So the action of a positive X system continues until it's interrupted by some mechanism. Other examples will be the blood clotting mechanism that we'll look at later on the semester, and even sneezing. It's kind of cool. Makes childbirth sound so simple, right? And everybody in here except for me is a lady. So I will not comment on that anymore. All right, we'll stop here and pick up with feed forward on Friday.